Okay. Give me a sec. Oh, what happened here? Give me a sec, guys. So sorry.
No,
Technical.
I had to wait an hour for food. You know what I'm saying? I can, you know.
You can wait.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I got you. I got you.
Yeah, see, thank you. Thank you. You know what I'm saying? I'm gonna get some food to eat with you.
What they saying to you in the chat?
Folks is gonna eat. We're gonna eat together. Because Jason and I,
we're gonna eat in community, folks.
This is a food conversation, ain't we? About to feed each other. So this makes sense.
That's right. You see? Joel, you be coming up with those quick.
That's only because I'm in community with people I love. Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, the stones.
Joel, but did you get the mac though? With the catfish?
So Bria told me the mac and cheese is too cheesy. Well, she's weird. She didn't feel about cheesy mac and cheese. I was just making any sense to me because it's cheese.
Yeah.
But I think, right. I mean, if I go back next time, maybe, bro, it was crowded, man. It was just like, folks was like, did people barbecuing outside? Like, folks is really out here celebrating Juneteenth. I'm like, yes.
Facts, yo.
Yeah. Like, for real. I know. Yeah. So y'all getting into the real nitty gritty over here. Jason, how you been, man? How's your day been, brother?
Okay, guys. I'm gonna go live now.
Are we live? Okay, I was streaming live on Facebook.
Yeah. All right, everybody. So sorry about that. Let's do this properly now, okay? Thank you for joining us tonight for this conversation, Black in America and African American and Afro-Dominican perspective. We are joined here tonight with my good brothers, Jason Rosario and Joel Leon. Jason is a product of a single parent home in the Bronx, New York. He created The Lives of Men, a vehicle for Black and Latino men to explore healthier frameworks of masculinity while serving as a resource as they navigate various life stages. As a motivational speaker and a media personality, Jason talks often focus on the intersection of self-actualization, identity, and masculinity, with a unique blend of style, culture, education, and spirituality. His aim is to inspire, activate, and nurture the development of well-rounded men. He is a graduate of NYU Stern School of Business.
Yo, whoever wrote that's pretty good.
No, you need all the accolades, okay? You need all the accolades. Joel Leon. Joel's words are where I go when I need some inspiration, and he never lets me down. Lin-Manuel Miranda. Yeah, that Lin. Joel Daniels, also known as Joel Leon, is a performer, author, and storyteller who writes and tells stories for Black people. Born and raised in the Bronx, Joel specializes in moderating and leading conversations surrounding race, masculinity, mental health, creativity, and the performing arts, with love at the center of his work and purpose. He is a LaGuardia High School of Performing Arts alum and author of the book about things I would tell my daughter and God Wears Durags too. His recent TED Talk on healthy co-parenting has been viewed over 1.2 million times globally. Yes. He's worked with the Gates Foundation and has been featured on the Today Show, Insider, the Columbia Journal, BBC News, Sirius XM, Forbes, Medium, Philadelphia Printworks, Blavity, and the Huffington Post. He has performed at the Apollo Theater, Joe's Pub, Rockwood Music Hall, Columbia University, NYU, and Webster Hall, and the Dominican Writers Platform as well. He currently lives in Brooklyn and is the father of Lila and Wes. Yeah. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us tonight. I'm so looking forward to this conversation. Let's get it.
Yeah. I mean, I was kicking things off by, we're not really kicking things off. I just wanted to ask Jason how he was doing because I love Jason. And for those that don't know, like, Jason and I was fortunate enough to be part of Jason's DMN platform on Yahoo. You know what I'm saying? For those that don't know, Yahoo, Jason, big. And we met there, cultivated love there, and so like a brother in arms, a brother in general. But yeah, man, how are you, man? How's your day been? How's your Juneteenth been?
Yo, it's been good. You know, today is my first off day. I took off intentionally today. I did no work, didn't check my emails, and just came in from the park. We were in Brooklyn, just chilling, vibing, listening to music. So right in this moment, I'm okay. But generally speaking, right, taking everything that's happening into account, what I would say is that I'm in a state of purposeful rage on a consistent basis. You know, it's really, really hard to be positive because it's like we don't get a full week to mourn one death before something else happens. Yeah. So it's really difficult, you know. But yeah, man, I'm doing my best to channel all those energies into healing and constructive activities. So that's the best answer I can give you in this moment. How are you?
I'm good. And you know, I had questions written down, but I mean, and like you and I, like Jason and I were joking over text about this. Like, we're probably not gonna get to any of them because even I'll answer that, but then I'm gonna ask you a question to follow up because you said something important. And I'm good, man. You know, I'm healthy. You know, I feel like there's been a lot of work that to kind of get us to this point, and I'm excited. I'm tired a little, you know, but I'm also hopeful. And for me, I think part of like even us having this conversation, and I think I don't want to minimize this because it's really easy for folks to go, we need action. And it's like, yes, we absolutely do. But there needs to, like, the conversations, I think, help ground the work that we do moving forward. Especially when we look at the that happens for the community, for the diaspora, right? You said something, and correct me if I'm wrong, purposeful rage is what you said, right? Is that the language?
Yeah, purposeful rage.
Please elaborate on that for the people, because I feel like I get it and I love it, and I'm very curious as to A, where that came from, and B, what that looks like and means to and for you.
Yeah. And words being, you know, we both of us being lover of words, right? We know that we use words intentionally. Mm-hmm. Purposeful, well, rage because of the obvious, right? Rage is just being angry about the state of affairs. We're dealing with two enemies right now that are killing our communities disproportionately, whether it's COVID or racism. And I think it's really hard not to be angry at that, because a lot of it, if you look at kind of the core issues and the reasons why it's killing us, is because of systemic oppressions and systemic inequalities over years and years and years and centuries, right? So it's hard not to be angry, but you know, being angry isn't productive on its own, right? Anger alone isn't a negative emotion, but it's how you use that anger that either makes it destructive or productive. And so that's why I said purposeful, because what I'm using this energy for is to, one, lean more into myself, lean more into my craft, lean more into my work, and hopefully create things that are going to move the conversations forward, the culture forward. And it's just, you know, I know no other way. You know what I mean? It's either going to be that I use this in a healthy way, in a positive way, or I'm going to self-destruct. I'm going to go out there and I'm going to start burning police cars and wind up getting arrested myself. And so that's what I mean about purposeful rage. It's this anger, but really doing my best to channel it into more positive activities.
Which I love, because I feel like a lot of the work that you've done, and I feel like we share this in such similar ways, like a lot of the work that you've done has been about using love as like the central point for all the things, and how you approach even just like the activist work and like in protesting and what that looks like. And I feel like that's it. The reason I was asking is because I think it's so important to be able to ground our work in something that's intentional, right? Like,
yeah,
I'm going to do this thing, but what's the intention behind it? You know what I'm saying? Like, before we got on this call, I was having a conversation with my Fred Joseph, and we're talking about like energy and like displaced energy and the idea of putting too much emphasis or energy into things that aren't serving or laddering up to like your bigger purpose or your bigger calling. And like purposeful rage for me is like a person, it speaks to someone who's like being intentional about not just the verbiage and language being used to describe a moment, but how your heart gets to show up in the moment so that you're doing work that again ladders up to not just your own personal beliefs and values, but also ladders up, I guess, to like
for the greater good.
Right, exactly. And our liberation.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So
well, I don't know if you had a follow-up, because I wanted to get back to something you just said, and maybe I'll wait. I'll let you lead, because what I was gonna ask might just open up a whole nother can of worms, and I want to leave it for the end.
Are you sure? You sure?
Yeah. I want to leave it to the end.
Okay. When we talk about the topic of this conversation, something that I'm very curious about, because as a brother who grew up, both brothers who grew up in the Bronx, as a man who identifies as African American, and you grew up in a culture and a system where essentially, not like we didn't see color, but like you grew up, we all pretty much were growing up in the same hood, in the same environment. We were all brothers, all sisters, kind of struggling, trying to figure out a way. I wonder for you, as an Afro-Dominican man, like, was there ever a time where you felt like you had to choose, or if you were forced to have, or you were put in situations or in conversations even where you felt like you were made to feel like you either had to be one or the other?
Yeah, it's funny because that's the second time, I don't know what it is about today, but that's the second time that I get the same question, right? Which is, in other words, when was that moment where you knew that you were X, right? Whether you were Black or whether you're Dominican or whatever. And your question is, not only that, but when did you ever have to choose, if ever, right? Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, I've always been aware of it, right? Like, we would go to school, and my sister's on the chat, so she can correct me if my thinking is off in anything. But, we used to go to school, and we used to be in obviously all English language courses. I had a lot of African American friends or Black friends, and in my daily life in school, I wasn't, how do I say it? I was what I was, right? I am how I am, and I show up how I show up. But then when I was at home, we would speak Spanish. And so, but I would look, I'm Black, right? And so that was always something that was present to me. So I don't think I was ever in a situation where I had to choose to be where, in order to assimilate and be accepted. I don't think I ever had to choose. I think the problem was finding the balance between what to bring where, you know what I'm saying? Because there were times where me bringing my Latino-ness, if you will, into my circle of friends was a valuable thing, right? And the reason I was part of that circle is because of that, my difference. But other times not. And so I needed to be very aware of when it was appropriate to bring that versus not.
That's powerful. That's super powerful. Like, because I think about, and it's a conversation I've been having, I feel like for a while now, with myself, like, how do you make the unaware aware, right? Like,
yeah,
you get to a place where folks are aware of their being, really, more than anything else. Like, even just outside of like however you show up and identify in the world, like, when do we get to a point or a position where it's like there is no need for defining, because we've already recognized the definition within us. So yeah, I love that, because like I think about how I grew up and how even now for me, like as 37 years old, it wasn't until I feel like anyway, when you looked at social media and like the conversations that were happening, where you started seeing real dialogue about being like Afro-Latino or Latino or Latinx, and like what that meant and what that looked like, what and seeing folks identify with that. And then also, I see a lot of folks in like especially speaking as a Black man, I've seen a lot of folks kind of project their biases about how people show up, which is something I've been struggling with. It's like, because now you're just figuring out, right? Like,
Right.
right? Like, oh wow, yeah, like I recognize the heritage and my roots, and now it's almost like become a point of contention for some. Like now, all of a sudden.
So let me ask you that, right? Because I think you're making a good point. You know, as a Black man, and I know your circle of friends has always been very diverse. Did you ever encounter a time, or have you ever had the feeling that, you know, someone like myself, for example, showing up was just like, nah, you're not Black, right? Or you're not Black enough, you know, so stop claiming that. Because a lot of people feel that way right now, where like, obviously Black Lives Matter is resurfaced, and we're asking a lot of questions about Latinos and Afro-Latinos specifically, our role in that. You know, a lot of Latinos have told me themselves, like, yo, I don't even know where to belong, because when I speak up for Black Lives Matter, it's just like, oh, well, you're light skinned, so you shouldn't even, you know what I'm saying? So it's hard for a lot of folks to figure out where to use their voices.
Yeah,
so what are your thoughts around that? Because I think it's what you were saying as well.
I get, you know, because we're having a frank conversation, I get frustrated. I get frustrated a lot with our community because, and granted, I can only speak for myself, right? But like, I think you know me well enough to know like empathy is a really big part of like how I show up in the world. And part of the work is like, I don't, and this is almost, I think it's very much related also too, for like when you look at the Black Lives Matter moment and like even allyship in that way, right? And it's like, now organizations are finally showing up. Now folks are finally identifying themselves as Black. Now folks like, for me personally, I don't care when you show up as long as you do. You know what I'm saying? I think it's really easy to assume that folks have the knowledge of and wherewithal to recognize their positions in life. And you know, not everyone went to grad school, not everyone's an intellectual. You know what I'm saying? So like, and even now I think about the language that we've been afforded. Like I think about my mom. My mom, born and raised in Dominica in the West Indies. I'm first generation. My mom struggled to get here to the States. Has afforded me the opportunity where I can sit down on a Zoom call and chat with my brother about some real shit. My mom didn't have the time to like understand the language and the nuances of Blackness and what that looked like and what that meant. And so for me, it's like, rather than kind of lambast people for coming in whenever they come in, it's more like, for me, it's more about how can we galvanize the community and embrace community who are willing to learn. Now, granted, I recognize the sort of a privilege I have in that. Like, you know, I'm a lighter skinned Black man. I'm a man in general. So like, I haven't really had to bear the weight of educating and being a sort of resource for individuals like Black women have. But I think it's important for us to allow room for those individuals who are just discovering themselves, because I didn't always know either. You know what I'm saying?
100%.
No one just wakes up automatically knowing all the things that they need to know about their history, about their ancestral heritage, about their struggle. Some people don't have the parents who are doing that work in the household. And so I can't assume that you're going to know. I can't assume that Twitter taught you, or that you're a woke, or whatever fucking language about how people show up in the movement and for the work. I think the part of our job is to be less defensive and more embracing about the work others are trying to do. Because folks who are trying to do the work, I can make room for. You know what I'm saying? And for me, that's the most important. Are you trying to do the work? Because if you are, then we can have a conversation about it, you know?
Yeah. That's such a good point. And the undertone of that is patience, right?
Yeah.
Having patience for wherever it's like halfway, right? Meeting people halfway, but also pushing their thinking and challenging them a little bit. You know, what that brings to mind, right, is as we're doing this work and we're talking a lot about, you know, Black Lives Matter and white people and how white people have shown up. One of the things that I've been saying recently, and this may not be popular opinion, but I think we all need to be a little bit patient with each other, right? One, because I think our allies need a lot of work to do. They have a lot of work to do to understand where they are with respect to privilege and white supremacy, et cetera, right? So they have their work to do. But one thing that I want to say, obviously we'll have this conversation, but for everybody on the chat that's listening, as people of color, y'all, like we also have work to do. Our work just looks a little bit different. You know what I'm saying? We just have to do a lot of unlearning of the ways that we've internalized all of this white supremacy and prejudice and colorism and all of that. And so what I would encourage all of us to do is yeah, it's easy to pile on white people right now, but I think it's a better opportunity, much more constructive opportunity to kind of turn the mirror on yourself and see how that's played, how you have been complicit in holding our own people down, right? And I'll give people an example of what that looks like, so that people, because it's like, yo, what do you mean? How have I been guilty of that? Well, the crabs in the barrel mentality, right? This idea that, I can't, there's not enough out here for all of us to win, so I got to stomp on Joel's neck because I got to go get mine, and we do that. It's like the classic divide and conquer. It's like, we don't work together, we don't organize, we don't help each other out because of this mentality of lack and this mentality of I've got to get mine. And so I think that's the work that we have to do in this moment, where right now it's our civil rights. You know what I'm saying? None of us were alive in the 60s. Here we are. This is our civil rights. So I don't know who tweeted this. It might have been you too, Joel. But if you ever thought about what you would do during the civil rights, what you're doing now is what you would have done. You know what I'm saying? And so I think that's really it for us. I just hope that we're taking this time to really look at ourselves deeply, man.
I love that, Jason. Me in the same boat, brother. Like, I think you know that already. I struggle with it because it's a hard conversation to navigate for a lot of folks. And even in my 9 to 5, I essentially put together what we'll call tentatively like rules of allyship, right? Like I was given the floor at our town hall, and basically with me it was like, recognizing your privilege doesn't make you a bad person. A lot of other things for like white allies, as well as like those who are maybe non-POCs, so even POCs and even us, right? Yeah. Like, what does that mean? And I think you're speaking to something powerful, because I don't separate the work of the movement from work of spirit. I don't think there's anything different, right? Like the way I show up and the way I show up in relationship to you is no different than the way I show up in relationship to Lila, my daughter, right? Like I see her as a total and full human, the same way I see you as a full and total human. And so for me, it's if I'm recognizing we're all in relationship to each other, even those who I might disagree with, or even those who might be in their bubbles and don't understand, it doesn't mean I'm soft with them, right? Because I think that's what people generally think. People generally think if you're being empathetic, if you're being loving, you're not also angry, right? You're also not voicing your opinion. Like if you're being loving, you're docile, right? You're not actually actively engaged in a way that's gonna cause real change. And I always bring it back to like the Panthers, and I bring it back to SNCC. Like the work that they were doing, whether the Panthers were storming the Capitol or not, like that free breakfast program was about love. It was about love of community. And if I love community, then that means I'm willing to do the work to show up for those that don't know, who don't know and want to know, and I have to be discerning about that, because there's some folks who are just showing up and being ignorant. I don't have energy. My energy, though, I can bring energy for those who are like, hey, listen, I don't know what to do, but here's how I want to show up. Or, we use the term like Google it, right? A lot. And I think about how racist coding is and SEO terms. And like, if you Google one thing, you're going to get a different answer than something else. I normally advise folks like, don't ask a Black woman. Like they've done enough labor as is. But I do think there's something to be said for the person is coming to you with a question, genuinely. If I have room and capacity to answer it or to do the work with it, then I'm going to do it. And if I don't, I can maybe push them to somebody else that does. But the idea of us being super defensive about all white folks, to me, is like, I question everybody. I don't care, Black, white, whatever. Like, what are your intentions and how you show up for the work? I might give you a little extra leeway. You know what I'm saying? If you're but at the end of the day, to your point, I think we can do a much better job of because that's wasted energy to me, man.
Yeah. I was gonna, you brought it up again, the word, and I'm just gonna fucking just dive in. I think we both agreed in many of our offline convos, man, that both of our favorite words is love, right? Love is in many ways, I'm spending a lot of time thinking about it, reading about it, writing about it, because it is very much a central theme in my life. And I don't mean just romantic love, right? I think a lot of people, when they hear love, they always hear romantic love. And the reason I say that specifically is because I do think that that's what's happening right now generally, right? There's just a lack of love in the world, a lack of love for the world itself and for the planet, right? On a very physical level, but on a very visceral level, there's a lack of love for one another. And I think you see that playing out where, you know, people just hoarding stuff at the supermarket or not wearing a mask because they don't want to look cool, or, you know, so it's just, there's this general lack of love for one another. So my question is, what role is love playing in your life in this moment?
Love is everything. Love is the foundation. Love is the key. And I love what you said, because it's not about the romance of it. Like, and again, I think that's a lot of white supremacy shit, where like love has kind of devolved into this fairy tale idea of boy meets girl, whatever. And it's like, we're not even talking about the romantic, even the platonic familial sense. It's like, how does love show up in our work? And like, how does empathy show up in the work? And so for me, it's been very important to lead with that first. Like, if I'm not intentional, and if the thing that I'm speaking, if the thing that I'm seeking, if the thing that I'm doing does not have attached to it, then I don't want to be a part of it. And so even when we look at the complex conversations we get to have as people of color, as persons of color, what I tend to see sometimes is like this treatment of love as a thing, again, that's very passive, right? And like relationship guru-esque, which is fine, which is important. That's just as important. But like, every movement that I can think of that has caused a stir and has meant something to people has involved love. Whether you look at suffrage, whether you look at civil rights, whether you look at organizations, right? Whether you look at MOVE, whether you look at CORE, whether you look at the Black Panthers, whether you look at Black Lives Matter, Ferguson, right? Like, this is all about love. It's like love of people, right? Love of community, love of our being, and what it means to see that potentially stripped away from us by white supremacy, right? By systemic racism, by a system essentially was not built in love at all, that we're forced to live in, right? That it was not structured for us, not meant for us to survive. And so I think there's more of a call to action for love because of that. And I think you're talking and pointing to something that's so important, because it's also about love of self, right? Like, if I love me, it's way easier for me to engage in conversations with anyone that might be centered around something that lives outside of that, because my center comes from love. So I'm not distracted by the other shit. You know, it's real. And, you know, I think also too, like, you know, we're a little older. And so I think about when I was younger, love is way different for me now than it was like 10 years ago, you know?
Yeah.
But I mean, I bring it back to you though, because I think that's such an important question. Like, how has love showed up for you? And before you get to that, I think about even just the protests, right? And like the initial protest in Harlem that you put the flyer up for, and how the conversation was like, I remember you asked me on Instagram, it was like, so what are we doing? What's the next step? And I hear the question, and then I see you do something that I know is very much motivated by love. And so I guess yes, bringing the question back to you, like, how was love shown for you during this period of time?
Yeah, man. I think, you know, love being such an important part of my life in terms of just the ways, I mean, so going back to something you said again, most people think that love is this ethereal, nebulous kind of thing that exists outside of yourself, and that if you're just so happen to be lucky one day, you'll tap into it and then you're happily ever after. And I don't think that's the case. I don't think that's how love works. I think love is a skill. Love is a verb. Love is something that you do. Love is something that you work at. Love is something that you choose on a daily basis. And again, not just romantic love, it's love for yourself, right? It's, I'm gonna eat a whole box of pizza or I'm gonna eat a salad. That decision is based on love. How much do you love yourself in this moment? So I think, what's that?
I love me some pizza, brother. Don't do that.
I hear you. No, I hear you. So I think, yeah, the love is playing a really important part in my life right now, because what I'm using this time for is to rebuild from the ground up. You know, I think all of our worlds, all of us, to certain degrees, but all of our worlds have been completely destroyed and brought down to the studs. And so what I think this time in our lives is, these first 6 months of 2020, is an opportunity for us to ask ourselves, like, who do we want to be? And what do I need to do to get there? So that when all of this subsides, I reemerge the me that I've always envisioned being. And that requires a lot of love for yourself. And then a lot of love for, the people around you. You know what I'm saying? It is as important. So you can't love anybody else. You can't love anything else without first loving yourself. And I think that's where I'm focused. I'm trying to infuse love in everything that I do, bro. Whether it's this call right now, whether it's the dinner that I'm about to make in a few minutes, or even just every little task of my day is a ritual that I infuse love into. And so that's how I'm choosing to live my life right now.
So then so this feels like a very rudimentary question, but like, how do you do that? Like, so this is a two-part question. So how do you do that? And how did you get to the place? And again, this is almost like being aware of being aware. Like, how did you get to a place where you knew that love had to be the way in, as opposed to like a lot of people choose it as it's an option. Like, I could be loving, I could turn up.
Yeah.
You know, like, how does that, and like, how did you learn that, do you think? I mean, granted, that's
no, it's a very good question. And I think it's something that I would hope everybody pays attention to very, very keenly. And that is, look at the outcomes in your life, right? For me, it's easy, right? Like, the times that I have not chosen the path of love were the times that have completely destroyed me, right? Or have completely led to, experiences that I have regretted, or not regretted, but, just less than pleasurable experiences. So that is as simple as I can make it for someone, is look at your outcomes, look at the outcomes in your life, weigh them, right? And then decide, are these the outcomes that I want in my life? And if they're not, then you got to retrace that back to the root of the decisions that you're making. And if the decisions that you're making are not based on love, then, there you go. And then at that point, you can decide over again.
That's powerful. That's powerful because, again, it goes back to pointing the mirror. And it goes back to actually what you were saying before, too, when we talk about white allyship, right? Like, what is the work that I'm doing on myself, right? Like, I'm pointing the mirror to myself and seeing how I'm showing up, and whether or not that's actually, and generally it almost always is, and if that's a reflection of the work and the ways that I'm engaging with other people. Like, when I think about the process of learning how to love myself, it was a difficult one because I think for me, a lot of it was very much romanticized. And a lot of the work that I was doing was very much centered around, like, being in love with a partner, right? And being in love, like, what does it look like? And again, kind of leaning back on this unfortunate trope of, like, I am a man, what can I get from this situation? Right? Like, how can this situation and this woman serve my expectations of love, as opposed to, again, the more vast experience of love, and having to get to a point where, again, I want to reiterate this because I think what you said is incredibly important. The outcomes. And again, that's you being aware, because there are a lot of folks, I feel like, who are not paying attention to the outcome. And I think there's also there's a very distinct difference between being attached to an outcome and paying attention to it, right? Like, me wanting the thing and then clinging to the thing and clinging to it, needing to be a certain way in order for me and ego to feel vilified. And another thing to be like, I'm recognizing that I did A, I did B and C, and then this is what happened. I don't like this. What can I do differently? What can I do? Not somebody else, not the movement, you know what I'm saying? Not white supremacists. Like, they have their time that we're dealing with now, but also in tandem, how can I deal with that on my own? Which leads me to the next question, actually. Wonderful.
Yeah.
I think what I've been struggling with for myself, well, not really struggling, I think, but something I've been thinking about a lot as well is duality, right? And like the duality of experiences and how we tend to, as a community, have difficulty dealing with duality. Like I can be angry and loving at the same time, right? I can also be a black man and a dad, or I can be a black, you know what I'm saying? Like, has duality ever been has that ever shown up in your life in a way where you've had to have conversations, whether it be about being Afro-Dominican or having to hold space for multiple ways of feeling and being? And how has that been for you, if that has been a thing for you at all?
Man, that's such a profound question. I got to think about, I mean, I'm sure that I have. I'm just trying to think about a scenario that can bring that to life, because, well, let me rephrase that. I'm 100% sure that I have, just because my lived experience and my personhood is a duality, right? I am a black man who happens to speak Spanish. Yeah. I am an educated man that has traveled the world, who has also happened to live in the hood. I mean, there's no deeper dualities in that, right? So my whole world is that. But is your question more, have I ever had to choose one or the other? Or is your question more, how has that been, what does that tension feel like?
I felt like, because I feel like, and I think you spoke about it so very well earlier, you've kind of, again, you've always lived that. And I think we all live that in some way, shape, or form, right? Because even when we look at our privileges as human beings, like we have able-bodied privilege, right? There are ways that we get to show up as brothers, as sisters, as uncles. I think there's always some level of tension to a certain extent of like the dual things and the ways that we show up. But I wonder, how has it felt for you to have to live in that experience? And you can choose whichever one it is. It's like, when I think about it, even now, when I thought about the question, it came up because of COVID. And a lot of the idea of folks were feeling very like disappointed, hurt, like people were grieving. And while also recognizing there's been like somewhat of a divine opportunity that's been created because of it. And seeing folks struggling with that specific duality of there's trauma happening, but then do I get to be happy? You know, I grew up, you know, I'm a black man, but I speak Spanish. Is that like, what does that mean to me? What does that mean to the community? I wonder, what does that feel like, I think?
Yeah. I get it. You know, in fact, that's real. You know, this is gonna sound weird. I hope it doesn't, because I trust that everybody on this call is of like mind. But I think I found my power in that duality. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. I have found, you know what I'm saying? Like, I have found the more that I exist in duality, and the more that that I'm aware of it, the more powerful I am, because it's like, yo, I could live here, yo, right? Like, I could live in the corporate boardroom and I could live in the hood. You know what I'm saying? Like, and I can navigate both environments very well. I can be subject to both pandemics, the racist and the COVID pandemics, and still thrive. You know what I'm saying? Like, and we're all thriving. So, you know, I think that's where, as people, right, Black folks, we have a built-in resiliency, man, that is incredible. I mean, no coincidence. Today's Juneteenth, and think about what we're celebrating, right? We're celebrating the fact that our ancestors, right, whether you're African American, right, or Black or not, or you're Caribbean or what have you, all of our ancestors were locked in chains at some point, right? And so we're celebrating that institution, that period of just stripping us to the core is gone, right? Because of that resiliency, because of our ability to live in duality, in plurality. You know what I'm saying? Being on the fucking farm, then being in the house, and then I mean, it's incredible just the how we've been able to survive. And I think that's the thing, right? It's in order to survive, it's like we have to have adapted to living in duality.
Yeah, man. Yeah, bro. I'm worried that's gonna sound weird. No, that's been it, man. That is it. It's we get to be more. We are more than one thing, and I think we've very much made it. You have to be this or this.
Yeah.
You in the hood or you in the boardroom. Either you black and you speak English and that's it, or if you
Right.
like, we get. It's like we're like robots at times when it comes to recognizing that, like, oh, you get to be more than one thing in a moment.
Right.
And like being very discerning about that, like, oh, okay, you get to be whomever and however you decide to show up and can show up in this space. Because like I know for me, you know, I grew up very much thinking that there was a difference between, like, I didn't know if I was supposed to call myself West Indian or Black. I didn't know. Like my father was born in Pensacola, Florida. Like my family comes from a lineage of my father's side of enslaved people, sharecroppers, right? In here in the States. My mom comes from colonialized Dominica. You know what I'm saying? So like my mom speaks patois. You know, like we're looking at a small island that was once under British rule, under French rule, like been passed around. And for me, I didn't know if it was like, am I supposed to be a Black man or a West Indian man? I don't know. Are those the same thing? And there was no one to have that conversation with at all, you know? And so I think for me, and I think very similar to you in somewhat of a different way, though, it's you grow up recognizing that plurality really allows you to embrace all the things. And I think what I'm seeing now, I feel like I'm seeing more people embracing all the things, and I'm also recognizing that apprehension that a lot of folks in our community have with those things. It's like even when we talk about love, I feel like people can't seem to distinguish between the love that allows you to love your partner and the love that also, I think, to a certain extent, allows you to burn down a Wendy's because you're so mad and you're like, I loved this human being who was alive. And so the way I direct that comes out this way, you know, as opposed to I'm angry. And granted, there's some folks who are doing that. We're like, I'm just going to anger. I'm going to fuck shit up. And it's like, yo, I'm Angela Davis angry. So I'm going to go to jail for this, right? And like, I'm going to do the work that needs to be required in order to ensure that our people get free. And I wonder what do you think and granted, I think this is more than just like a one solve situation, but I wonder, what do you think will it take for us as a community to start embracing love as a means for radical change?
Wow. Great question. So what do I think it's going to take for our community to embrace love as the tool for radical change? I think we're really close. We're really close. I think we got to get to rock bottom. And I think we're very.
You don't think we're there yet? You think?
No, I don't think we're there yet. You know, I just think we got to get to a point of despair where we just got to get so tired of being tired that whatever's out there is better than what we're experiencing. And I think that's what it's going to take for us to just try, like, what we have tried everything else. We have tried being angry. We have tried fighting back. We have tried being passive and docile and all these things. We've even talked about, going back to our motherlands, right? Like just leaving these people. So I just think it's just, we have to get to the point where love has to be the solution. And I think part of the reason why we're not there is because choosing that is hard, right? To say, I'm going to love my way through Trump calling me and my community shithole countries every day. I'm going to love my way through that. I don't think people understand what that means, right? Like, that doesn't necessarily mean that you got to condone or love or even respect what this man says, but it's just maybe look at him with a lens of compassion, right? And that's what I'm trying to do now, is understanding that me leading in love with respect to dealing with him would be realizing that he just lacked love in his house. Mm-hmm. He lacked love when he was a young man, right? He's lacking love around him. And so he's willing to say anything, and he'd rather be hated just to feel like he's being acknowledged than being right or saying something positive. So anyway, I know I'm rambling, but I think it's just choosing love is not easy because it requires you to see the humanness in someone that may not see the humanness in you.
Yeah, that's powerful, man. Because you are better than me, brother. Because you know my compassion. Like I think a lot about Kwame Ture and talking about, right, like essentially like the oppressor has no heart. And man, it's been hard for me. It's been, and not in the sense of like showing up in love, because like that's not hard. But you know, again, keeping it 100 because you're my man. Like in my head, what I've imagined, Jason, is like there's a certain group of people we put on a boat. You know what I'm saying? Like there's a core group. Some of them is brothers and sisters who are just not, who are like homophobic, transphobic, whomever. Put them on a boat or a shuttle and send them on their way. Because what I struggle with is, I think there are some folks who are using this as an opportunity to show their true selves in a way. And I struggle with having love combat that. And what I think what I'm trying to get to is like what I've recognized for me is we have to be louder than the oppressors. And that's kind of what I'm touting. Like they have really big bullhorns, you know? They also have a lot of houses in the Senate. And so I think part of our work and our job is to illuminate love more frequently.
Yeah.
It's not about like police officers kneeling and playing basketball with little kids in the playground.
Right.
It's about, for me, it's like, how do we use love to abolish like police systems and police states? How do we use love to like do this work? And what I've been trying to get across, and what I appreciate having someone like you do this work as well, it's like recognizing that love is so powerful, and we limit it so much. We limit it so much in the ways it gets to show up in the work that we do. And there is this very much inherent fear, because if we're doing that, then we're being very vulnerable, right? Yeah. Right, and it also means it goes back again to which I think you brought up earlier. We then have to start pointing the mirror at ourselves, right? Like, if I'm checking this person for not showing up for the community, whatever, how am I doing that? And is that rooted in love, or is that rooted in opportunity and ego? Which is what I tend to see not happen a lot, but like some of the divide I see in the movement sometimes comes to credit, right? And do I need to take credit for the movement, and who gets credit, who gets credit, how and where? And that's a whole nother conversation. Mm-hmm. What time? Oh wow, damn, it is 7:54.
Wow.
So I guess.
Any questions out there, yo? Like, chime in on the chat. I see the chat is lit, but.
For everyone who's here, you could show yourselves if you like, and ask questions. A lot of you guys have that chat real active.
Let's see the beautiful faces. Who's on? And hit us with your questions. Let's make this a combo.
Yeah, please ask.
Hi, Jerica. What's up, Nicole Grimes?
Just like your mom. Look at her.
Yeah. It's just like my mama. What's up, y'all? Any questions? Hit us. Yeah, how's everybody feeling?
Wow, y'all so active in the chat, but don't, what? Sharina has a lot to say in the chat. Susan Barnes, come on, ladies, I'm gonna call you out. Kathy, come on. There's a few men in the conversation as well.
Right. I have a question just for anybody, for anybody that wants to answer, but specifically for you, Joel. You know, we're in a time right now where it's really difficult, you know, for all of us. I think all of us are trying to find consistent joy, and it's really hard. And I've had conversations like this with friends of mine over the last few weeks, is that, you know, you get these periods of like intense joy, and you're just like, yes, I feel good, I feel alive, and you're like on cloud nine, and then literally the next minute you're back in the doldrums. And so how are you finding consistency in joy, if at all, you know? And then what would you offer folks that are listening in for them to find that consistency and joy?
I think that's a beautiful question, Jason. And, you know, it's funny because anytime we're talking, I always feel like I'm talking to a mirror. Granted, we're all mirrors, but I don't base my joy on external circumstances, you know, like, and it's not to say I'm not affected by the trauma that we're seeing happen now, but I think the trauma has always been present. Like, we are birthed in trauma, right? Like, whether you come through vaginal birth or a C-section, there's like some level of tension and pressure. And I think for me, what I've recognized is like, I have to make it okay for myself to be happy. Like, dog, like I woke up this morning and there's a billboard on 41st and 7th with like a tweet of mine, like just sitting in Times Square. Now, I could do one or two things about that. I can be like, damn, you know what I'm saying? But, you know, we still haven't arrested Breonna Taylor's murderers. Like, and granted, I think I can hold space for both. I think I can fight this good fight while also being like, I get to embrace and engage with the small things that bring me joy. In fact, I have to, because if I don't, the system will eat me. Like, the system will eat us alive. The system was created to steal not just our joy, but our lives. You know what I'm saying? Like, when you look at the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, it was not created for us. What do we consider people? So for me, my work is to find my joy that lives outside of the looting, outside of protesting. It's like, how can I find joy in the midst of the trauma, and recognizing that joy is going to allow me the opportunity to also dismantle and decolonize the system. You know,
Mm-hmm.
There's a level, there's revolution in our Black joy. And the more I can embrace that, the easier it becomes for me, I think, to lean into it. It's like exercise, man.
Yeah. That's such a good take. You know, in terms of how I'm trying to find consistent joy, it's trying to become more childlike. You know what I mean? All of us are home. All of us are sedentary. We have nowhere to go. We have nowhere to be. So it's exploring what that looks like for me. What are the things that make me belly laugh, right? Like, we all love those really deep belly laughs, those moments where we're like, we can't breathe and we're crying. Like, I'm searching for those moments on an active basis. You know, doing my best to enjoy the little things, going out, getting some fresh air. I've made it a commitment to myself. I mean, those that know me know that I'm very comfortable being at home for 5 straight days in my little cave, you know, thinking, reading, writing, and stuff like that. And I've made it a point just to go out, even if it's right outside the building, and just like breathing in fresh air every day, even if it's for like a minute, because it does go a long way. You know what I'm saying? So it's the little things that often become, or actually are indeed the big things that I'm trying to focus on as far as finding joy.
I love that.
Anybody else? How about anybody? I want to hear from like everybody that's listening. Like, how are y'all finding joy? Ruben, chime in, brother. Good to see you.
What's up, man? How you doing?
I'm good, brother.
For me, you know what's crazy? A lot of times I feel like now I got a 5-year-old, wow. And a lot of times I feel like I put too much pressure on him to find joy from, and I almost feel like it's unfair. So I'm struggling now because I'm working from home and I'm trying to navigate through all this stuff and like trying to figure it out. And then I finally get a break from work, and then I look at him and he makes me happy, but then I feel like, oh my God, I'm being overbearing. So I'm like, do you have any suggestions? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, my daughter's in college right now, so yeah. I don't have kids. I don't have kids in the home, but I don't know, Joel. I mean, that's such a profound question, right? It's just like, we don't think about what we're taking and the withdrawals that we're making from the people in our lives. And I think what you're saying, Ruben, is that you don't want to make too many withdrawals. You also want to make sure that you're depositing into him as well, yeah, as a young man. So that's so profound. I don't know, Joel. You have young kids. I don't know if that resonates with you.
Well, I mean, I first of all, Ruben, thank you for that, brother. I think I don't know, man. You know, I think you asking the question is part of the work. You know, what I recognize, I think us asking and probing creates space for that, you know, because you know, kids don't know no better, man. You know what I'm saying? And I think, but at the same time, it's being able to recognize that your 5-year-old has the wherewithal and capacity to also tell you, like, nah, dad, chill. You know what I'm saying? Like, my Lila is 4, West is 4 months. Lila is very much, and granted, I'm dealing with a long distance situation with my daughter, Lila. Lila is very much like, dad, leave me alone. You know what I'm saying? Like, kids are gonna let you know, especially a 5-year-old, they're gonna let you know when you're being overbearing. I think you even having the question allows spirit to do the work for you in that way. You know what I'm saying? Because now you're being mindful, and again, this kind of goes back to what Jason and I were talking about, I think, about the awareness of awareness.
Yeah.
It's almost like an out-of-body experience where you're like, oh, I'm aware of how I'm showing up. Is my child is my child receiving of that? Is my child understanding of whatever's happening? They are, like, they're still humans. I wouldn't worry too much about it, man. Like, if you're being overbearing, trust me, they will let you know. And I think Jason can speak to this. I think the older they get, the easier it becomes for them to let you know when you are becoming overbearing. And they do it very explicitly. You know what I'm saying?
12-year-old.
Yeah.
It's very true.
Yeah. I mean, I think the other thing that's important there, Ruben, and I think you and I have always had these conversations, bro, and that is, you know, when you're thinking about your awareness of drawing too much from your son is just a friendly reminder for you to pour into yourself, right? Like, what are you doing for yourself so that you don't feel like you're having to draw so much from your son and from others? So, you know, just a friendly reminder to you to figure out how you want to invest and pour into yourself so that you're not pouring from an empty cup.
I love that.
There was a question in the chat, guys. Sixto is asking, can somebody talk about what it means to raise conscious Black or Afro-Latin kids during this time?
Before, and just so you know, and so, Sharina, we're going to get to your question after this, I promise. Don't worry.
Oh, did I miss one? I'm so sorry. Go on.
No, it's okay.
Cool. So Andrew, you're going to monitor the questions in the chat because they're moving
Sure.
fast.
If everyone could just raise their hands, I would see you in the participant box, but I'm also going through the chat.
All right. So yeah, that's a great question. You know, I've gotten a lot of that recently as well. Is, you know, for men, for example, that are raising young sons, it's like, when do I start to talk to him about everything that's happening? You know, when do I tell him about police brutality? And I think that's just broadly with kids in general. Like, you know, we need to have these conversations with our kids earlier on. Whereas I don't ever recall my mom having to sit me down and talk about, you know, some of the stuff. So I think if the question is, how do we raise more conscious kids? I think we just have to, one, we can't underestimate what they understand. You know, my daughter is 18 years old, and I've never baby talked her, right? Maybe that's just me, I'm weird. But, you know, I've always spoken to her like an adult, as though she can understand and reason for herself. Because I've always told her, I said, look, I want to give you as much information as possible to help you make as informed decisions as possible. Just knowing that you're not always going to make the right one. But I think that's where it starts, is let's not underestimate kids in general, whether you have kids of your own or you're helping raise them in some way. I think it's important to engage them in conversation and ask them questions too, because just because we're the adults doesn't mean that we can't learn something from them either. So that's what's worked for me.
I agree. I use Jason's approach. I keep it real with my kid.
No, Angie, I think that's it. I mean, you know, like, I have this conversation. I remember I bring this up a lot, but like, Rhea, my partner, and I were having a conversation. And I remember her telling me, like, Joel, you're talking to me like Lila. And I'm like, I talk to everybody like Lila. Like, I don't, you know, it's like, I don't talk to Lila any differently than I would talk to any other human being that I care about and have compassion and empathy for. And so part of that is, I think it's also up to your discretion. I think to Jason's point, it's incredibly important, I think, to not underestimate how much our children understand very early on. But it's also, too, you have to recognize, like, in the context of who your child is, you know, and like, is your child equipped to potentially handle this kind of conversation in the way that you plan on approaching it? You know, like, because what's going to work for my daughter Lila may not work for my daughter West. And so part of that is me having to be mindful of that, because if you have a household with multiple children, maybe you don't have that conversation with both children at the same time. But again, that's on you. And recognizing where your children are developmentally. And then like, I think being able to kind of steer the conversation that way.
Yeah.
Sharina's question was, how would you propose to approach someone who's filled with hate with love?
Discernment, I think, is important. I think what I've recognized is that I can't engage with everybody, Sharina, in that way. And like, not everyone is honestly deserving of my time or energy. Like my energy and my time is extremely precious, and not even on some ego shit, but just recognizing that there's work that I have to do physically as a man and just physically as a person who's trying to show up for not just the movement at hand, but for the work ahead. And so part of that is recognizing who is showing up with hate and who's showing up with hate in a way that's because they're lacking information. You know what I'm saying? When I look at like a Ben Shapiro or I look at a Candace Owens, these are people who are very knowledgeable and very much aware of what they're doing. I don't engage with that. I block them. I don't even have conversations with them. Twitter, Instagram, whatever, because their motive is not to engage. Their motive is to incite. Like, they're trolls. And so for me, whether it's a troll on Twitter or a troll in the hood, the hate, and unless of course that hate is somewhat dangerous, right? Like if we're talking like homophobia, transphobia, that's hate that can be dangerous to a life. That can like cause the loss of a life. That's a different kind of engagement than a person who's just like, I can't stand blackies and go back to your country. Like, I ain't got time for you. You, whatever. Like, there's hate that I think that devolves from a place of lack of knowledge and awareness. And that's the hate that I'm okay with coming to with love and having a conversation about. And a lot of that is rooted in, like, again, to what Jason pointed out before, it's about pointing the mirror to myself. If I love myself, it's easier for me to do that. And if I'm looking, honestly, if I'm looking at this individual as a child in that way, right, then I think it allows for more room for conversation and growth in that space.
Yeah, I mean, nothing to add. That was as eloquently put as could be. So I know that there's other questions, so let's jump in.
Yeah, so we have Kathy. Kathy says, I have a 24-year-old and a 12-year-old. I'm also a Girl Scout leader. I've had different conversations at different levels, and I found myself stuck and sometimes speechless during these conversations because I have my own opinions and I don't have all the answers. But at the same time, I want to be informative, respectful, and compassionate to their own opinions without misleading. What conversations are you having with today's youth?
Wow, that's such a deep question. I think it's a hard one because as parents, or as adults, right? Because I want to respect the fact that maybe not all of us on the call are parents, but as an adult, right, or who might be involved in raising a kid, it's a tight rope to walk when you, as an adult, are trying to give that child enough structure, right, and enough guardrails for them to walk and hopefully not make life-altering mistakes and give them an opportunity to get to adulthood when, you know, they can be who they're meant to be. It's hard to do that without also interjecting inadvertently your own fears and your biases, right? So I think that's where the self-work comes in, right? Is understanding who you are before you're a parent, before you're a caregiver. You have to really get an understanding of who you are. And I think not just with children, but we often as adults make the mistake of offloading our own fears and insecurities into other adults. You know what I'm saying? And so I think it's really important for us to be mindful of who we are, do the shadow work. And I'm going to actually, towards the end of this, I'm going to suggest a book for everybody to pick up. Actively do the shadow work and like look at the parts of yourself that are very scary to look at, because oftentimes that's what's either preventing you from raising your child the way that you want to, or it's actually leading you to make a lot of mistakes that you won't realize until that child is 30, 40 years old. But it always starts with you. And I think it's really difficult for most people to hear that because we always think that the answer is outside of us, but the answer is always within us. You know what I'm saying? And I think that's where it starts.
I'm going to take a cue from Jason. That was so excellently.
You want to add to that, Joel, or are you good?
Good. I'm good.
Okay, Brittany. Brittany says, what advice do you have for young Dominicans calling out anti-Blackness in their own immediate extended families? Should every Dominican consider themselves Afro-Latins? I understand this also ties in with the conversation about being boxed in, but for Dominicans who are oscillating in the in-betweenness, especially with our colonial history, it is important to fight anti-Blackness and embrace our roots. Hope this makes sense and is not very naive.
Not naive at all.
I say
Should I jump in? Should I jump in, Joel? Yeah. Because I think you're the Dominican one on this call, not me.
Who's the Dominican?
Joel is.
Joel?
Don't say.
Yeah, I think, so I'm going to use an example from my own family. My grandmother, and Jerica, you can jump in if I'm leaving anything. But you remember when grandma used to call me morenito bonito, right? Or morenito fino. And what that means is, though it's a compliment, what that means, Joel, for your Dominican Spanish.
Credit, man.
You know what it is. You know, it's a compliment, but veiled. It's all veiled in a very insidious form of prejudice, right? And colorism, right? Because they would never call, if I was light skinned, they would never say, she would never say, you know, que blanquito más fino. You know what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. So for me, and even just when she used to live with us when I was in high school, she would be like, oh, eto prieto, right? Like this really ugly word for African Americans. And what I would have to do, and Jerica would do it, and we would all do it, is be like, but grandma, look at how dark you are, right? We would point that out to her. And we would point out the foods that she loved, the music that she listened to, right? The clothing that she wore. All of that was African. And I think what she meant by that, I think I just have to say this on this call for the sake of all of us being on the same page, so I'm gonna call it out, and that is when our parents and when our abuelas and our tias say, oh, I'm not Black, what they mean is that they're not African American Black. Yeah. You know what I'm saying? Because what they see with that is the stereotypes that are being reinforced, right? That African Americans are lazy, that they're criminals, that they're this, that they're that. And that's what they're saying, right? They're not necessarily denying their African root, though there is some way to go there, right? Like there's a part of that, at least not consciously. I see your face, Angie. They're not denying it on a conscious level, I don't think. But what I think at least my grandmother meant, was that she wasn't, quote unquote, African American Black. And I think that I don't know what's dangerous. I don't know if that's more dangerous, or if it's more dangerous to acknowledge or not acknowledge your roots. But I think that would be something that I would always call her out on. And, you know, whether she ever learned that lesson or not, she at least stopped saying those things around us. So I would hope that that was effective. Does that make sense?
No, I mean, Jason, I think that makes a lot of sense, and I'll keep it brief, because again, my experience is different as a Black African American male, right? I think when I had, like, we don't get to disassociate ourselves from our history. Like, if we do that is a conscious effort to do so, right? Like, now granted, I brought up before, my mother didn't have the language, right? She didn't have the access to the language and the tools to be able to properly distinguish between, okay, what does it mean to be a Black woman in America who has Caribbean roots, right? Like, what does that look like? My mom wasn't reading the textbooks, and I think part of our work, and I'll bring this back to, like, when I was in therapy, and my therapist would tell me, my mother is not first generation. My mother doesn't know that if her son was featured in a magazine that she doesn't know, that that's a big deal. My mom used to think that GQ was, like, me being on the cover of GQ was it. Any other magazine outside of that didn't make any sense to her. So my therapist told me I had to print out the magazine articles to show her the work so she could understand why this mattered. And so I think I bring that up because part of that work, again, when we talk about shadow work, when we talk about inner child work, a lot of that comes back to love and empathy. Like, our parents, our grandparents are coming from a place where they didn't have the access to the tools that we had. We have an opportunity to educate folks. And sometimes that comes up in subtle ways, like, nah, like, your skin is as dark as mine. Well, like, what does that mean? And it also comes up in, like, we can have really diverse conversations and unpack the trauma and colonialism and what that looks like. And so for us not to talk about it is another way for us to avoid the trauma and the conflict of what it looks like to show up for our Blackness. Because there's a whole history attached to that. And if we're not discussing the history of that, we're not really sitting with who we are as a people. Mm-hmm. And that is important, I think, for our liberation. So we have to do both. I don't think there's even room to not. Because even if the conversation is difficult, it still needs to be had.
100%. You're on mute, Ange.
We have a question here that was just texted to me because somebody's watching the Facebook Live. And they're asking, hi, Joel and Jason. We can't talk about being Black in America without talking about the treatment of Black women. What is the conversation Black men and Afro-Dominican men are having around the ways our Black women are violated? Just this week, an Afro-Dominican writer publicly wrote out about being violated and folks in the community supporting the person who violated her. There is this idea of protecting our men because we are Black. However, at what point do we hold them accountable? At what point do they hold themselves accountable? What does that work look like?
I think Jason kind of spoke to this before. We talk about using the mirror, and we talk about white supremacy. I'm all for the duality of a conversation. We can have two conversations at once. We can talk about white supremacy and white privilege, and we could also talk about Black male privilege, and we could talk about catcalling, we could talk about street harassment, we could talk about sexual harassment, we can talk about victim shaming, right? Like, there's a lot of things that I think are steeped in religious beliefs, right? Like, if you weren't wearing that, then that wouldn't have been a problem, right? If you hadn't shown up to church in that way, that wouldn't have been a problem. Like, a lot of the work that we have to do as Black men involves unpacking how we've used and viewed Black women in the means in a way in order to receive or like obtain something. And I think, so part of the work for me is like, it starts at home. It starts with like my nephew. It starts with like any of the young folks I have the opportunity to engage with in a room about what it means to be a Black man and have privilege. Because I think there's a tendency to think because I'm a Black man, I've been victimized, I see George Floyd, he looks like me, and not seeing that I'm still a man. I, Joel, get to show up in rooms in a very different way than Black women do. I just do. I'm lighter. I'm a male. So like my anger and angst sometimes is seen as construed as sexy, right? It's like, it's attractive. A darker skinned woman showing up in that same room is aggressive. She's angry, right? She's volatile. And so the work for us is back to healing. Because if we're not unpacking how Black men get to show up in spaces, right? Like, I can recognize like our trauma and our victimization while also recognizing we as a community have work to do. And a lot of that lives offline. A lot of the work that needs to happen is not like a tweet. It's not an Instagram photo. It's none of that. It's who am I talking to am I talking to the niggas on the block? Am I stopping street harassment when I see it? If I see a sister that seems like she's in trouble, am I engaging in a way that's preventing an opportunity for some real destructive shit to happen? But a lot of that is awareness too. Like, again, when Jason talks about, if we're not being aware of how we're showing up, how do we make people aware? And I think that's the work. And a lot of that is healing work.
Yeah. I think what you spoke about some of the more practical ways that it shows up, Joel. So I won't even add to that. What I will say though, is that, acknowledging what is, and that is that we as Black men, Black Latinx men, have let women down, right? Full stop. You know what I mean? And I think, why is that? Some of the theories that I've started to think about are, when a community, as we all are in this moment, when a community is under siege and when we're under attack the way that we are in all angles by multiple enemies, what tends to happen is that community fragments and it turns on each other for the sake of survival. You know what I'm saying? And so I think what's happening right now is that we're seeing Black men turn our backs on Black women. Not I wouldn't say it's purposeful, but it's for the sake of what we think we need to do to survive, and vice versa, right? Black women are turning their backs on Black men for their own survival. And I think that's a really difficult truth to accept, because what we're talking about here as a community is that our collective survival relies on us working together, right? And us having each other's back and taking care of one another. And I don't just mean, again, romantic, right? Like, yeah, let's take care of ourselves in relationships, but let's also take care of ourselves spiritually and mentally and, you know, in every which way. And I think that's what women are feeling right now, is that men aren't stepping up on their behalves. And, you know, I don't know what the situation is, Angie, but I do know that overall, over the last week, I'm sure we've all seen it, that we see more attention being paid to the men that are being murdered at the hands of police than we are women. And that is a fact. And it also touches on this idea that women of color, Black women, Latinx women, are oftentimes, they're more apt to die in the hospital giving birth, because the perception is that you all are more, you can take pain, you can take more pain than your average person. And so, you know, there's just this deep-rooted, insidious attack on Black women that we as Black men are now perpetuating because we feel like we need to survive. And so, you know, it's survival of the fittest, right? When that happens, it's like, I don't care who it is, I need to live, and I need to live to see another day. And so what I would like to see is, and I think we're all guilty of it, right? As men, and Joel, you can attest to this, right? It's in doing the work that we're doing around masculinity, it's very easy to say, oh, you know, women just don't get us, right? And just kind of groupthink in that way, and just kind of alienate ourselves from them. And then vice versa, right? Like women will be like, men ain't shit. You know what I'm saying? It's just like that groupthink perpetuates within yourselves. And so that's not productive. And so what I'd like to see, and I think what you and I are doing differently with respect to this work around masculinity and feminism, is exploring what men have to do, what is our work to do, while at the same time exploring how we can show up for women differently. Whereas in the past, in previous movements around feminism and masculinity in the 60s and 80s, what those movements were about were very individual in nature. It was like, how do we as a gender survive, as opposed to how do we as a community survive? And I think that's that's different than what we're seeing right now.
Yeah, and I love that, Jason. This conversation we're probably going to touch on tomorrow at 2 p.m. But I think about our attachment to masculinity and Black masculinity and what that looks like, right? And so even when I like, Twitter is a very good microcosm of like the larger conversation. And so what I tend to see is like, what I've been seeing is like from like the Tariq Nasheeds of the world, like the Umar Johnsons, like folks who kind of follow that flock in that conversation. It's been, like when you talk about LGBTQ, you're being divisive, but like we out here in the streets protesting for women, and it's like us as Black men not being able to remove ego out of the conversation, which I think, if you want to bring it to like an easier way of like looking at relationship and how we are in relationship with each other, and how we so often become defensive when we're challenged, right? When we look at a J. Cole, you know what I'm saying? Like when we look at, okay, I can use this opportunity to talk about all the other things that are affecting the community, but I'm having a conversation somewhat about no name, right? And it's like, part of that is because ego felt attacked. Like I felt like you were calling me out, so I have to show up in a certain way. And I think we as Black men, it would behoove us to, and again, the work that you're doing, I think the work that I'm trying to do is removing ego out of the equation and saying, how can I hold myself accountable for what has been ailing the community, and how do I get to show up for Black women in that way? And recognizing nuance of that conversation. We do a very poor job of that. A poor job of like holding ourselves accountable and saying, okay, I hear you, and okay, so you're telling me I've hurt you. How do I show up for the work? As opposed to, like you're hurt, that's your problem, which I think tends to be how our conversations involving Black women evolve.
Yeah, no, vice versa. It's like when we as women to men to, you know, those of us who identify as men, those of us who identify as women, whenever we're having dialogue and interacting with each other, if we have the audacity to call one another out on things, the first thing that happens is defensiveness, right? It's like, what do you mean? Like, it's impossible. I'm working, I'm cleaning, I'm coming through, I'm you know, or doing all the things, and I'm still, and you trying to tell me that I'm not delivering on something? It's a really hard pill to swallow for a lot of us. And so I think the first reaction hopefully should not be one of being defensive. It should be one of questioning. It's like, why do you feel like that? Tell me more, right? Like, excavate a little bit more and try to understand where that sentiment is coming from. And that's not easy to do, right? Especially after a long day of work, you're just like, yo, I just want to watch Netflix and chill. But I think if we are to transform our relationships, I think it's that level of intention, again, love, right? Choosing to go in that space with love is what it's going to take.
I love that. A friend of mine, Shanika Golden, and it was in response to the J. Cole, like No Name situation, was like, critique is not the same as canceling. You know, like I think we can do a really good job of recognizing that we can be challenged as a people, as a community, and recognizing that challenging doesn't mean I don't love you. It doesn't mean I won't forgive you. What it does mean is, like, I'm seeing behavior that's questionable. I'm seeing behavior that's dangerous, right? I'm seeing behavior that essentially could lead to the death of a trans woman, of a Black woman, of a non-binary individual. What does that look like? And being open to having the dialogue. And I think a lot of that is therapy and healing. Like, we're so steep in our projections and our biases about the opposite sex and like how we get to show up. And then like the intersectionality of, granted, it is very different being a Black man versus being a Black woman, but the layers of being Black and then being a man, and what it looks like to have to show up as a man and as a masculine man, a masculine facing man, and what that means. And the more we can do work to kind of deconstruct that, right? Like, and I would behoove all those who have not watched Jason's Dear Men Yahoo series to do so, because I think a lot of the work is men, Black and white, in between, like whatever, trying to unpack the associations of masculinity and what that means. That's the work. It's like unpacking everything that we've clung to, and that's the work that I think we're trying to do when it comes to men, and specifically Black men.
100%.
On a basic level, how come we never hear our Black men apologize?
We do. I don't think you hear the right. I think the problem is the wrong motherfuckers at the platforms.
An apology is a heartfelt apology means a lot.
And Angie, like,
rarely, if ever, hear it.
And Angie, so like I apologize to you. I ain't done nothing to you, but I apologize because we as men have not shown up and Jason spoke to it eloquently before. We have not shown up in ways that I think that's exemplary of like how we as a community want to show up. But there are brothers doing the work. When I think of a Jason, when I think of a Mikel Clark, when I think of brothers who
This is why you two are in this conversation, because you're two brothers doing the work.
Angie, thank you. But like part of the work is like, how do we give, like, there was a whole big riff about Terrence. I don't know if folks will follow, but like Terrence J and Marlon Wayans are having this whole conversation about whatever the fuck they were having a conversation about. And my point was like, if you give people the platform to speak, don't be upset when they speak shit that you don't agree with. If you want to see conversations about Black men showing up for the community, pay Jason.
Be open to listening too, and the dialogue, the conversation.
Exactly. Like, pay Black women and the Black men who are showing up for community to work, so that we're not seeing the same. Like, I don't want to see Charlamagne the God having another conversation about mental.
Yes. Me neither.
Like, hire Jason. Like, or like hire a person who's like doing the work, who's not also harming Black women. Like, what are you doing? But like, we operate in the same circle. So for me, my job has been like, I have followers. So like, I'll take this to the grave. I'll raise the name of a Jason, of a Fred, of a Mikel Clark until the day I die, because they're doing the work. I don't give a fuck about a Charlamagne because he's not doing the work and he's harming us. And like, how do we uplift the voices that are doing the work, supporting us as a community, Afro-Latino, Afro-Latina, like non-binaries, like people with disabilities, like how are we making room for a more inclusive conversation?
Yeah.
That's work.
Yeah. I want to go back to that question about how do we apologize, right? That was the question?
Yeah. Well, why don't we? It was more.
Why don't we? Oh,
why do you rarely say I'm
why do we
sorry?
rarely? I don't think we know how to, right? Like apologizing, you got to learn how to apologize. Apology isn't, yeah, I'm sorry if you felt that way. Like,
don't try.
It's like, yo, no, I feel a certain way and you did something to contribute to trigger that. So own it, right? And I think that's the thing. We don't know, one, the technique of apologizing, what that's like. But then we also aren't comfortable opening ourselves up to being told that we're not meeting standards, right? I know myself, it's hard, right? Like if I'm a people pleaser, I try to do my best to have everybody be happy with me. And if someone tells me, Jason, you fucked up in this area, it's like the end of the world. It's just like, fuck. So to apologize, it's almost like admitting failure to me. And I'm not speaking for anybody else, but I think that's a big part of why you don't see men apologize more. It's a very vulnerable place to be. It's a very scary place to be, especially if you don't feel like the people around you are going to hold space for you and for your humanness.
Yeah.
Is that going to be your next Dear Men? Let's learn to apologize.
I don't know. We'll see. We'll see.
I think we have another question too, Angie. I feel like there was. Oh yeah, here we go. There's some Sixto again, which is how do we as Dominican men approach our own conditioning around masculinity?
Whole other Zoom conversation.
It's a whole nother Zoom conversation. I mean, look, I'll say for the sake of not knowing if the other men on here are Dominican or not, I just think it's generally speaking for men, how do we approach this conversation? I think we just have to acknowledge that what we've been taught doesn't work anymore. You know what I'm saying? Like we are taught this idea of what it means to be a man that is outdated and it doesn't fit the times. And so I think that's where it starts. And again, look at the outcomes in your life. How are your relationships? Are your relationships healthy? Are your relationships uplifting? Are they partnerships or are they codependencies? So, you know, look at those outcomes and look at your relationships and see what's working. But I would also say that, you know, the things that we're taught not to do, and that is to be emotive and to be quote unquote soft, are the very things that are going to open up the type of love or the opportunity for the type of love that we all yearn for. Right? Like, it's so ironic that the more vulnerable we are and the quote unquote weaker we seem and the softer we are as men, I'm talking to men in particular, that is the very key that opens that door to love. And it's so crazy, but the only way to do that is to walk through that love, right? And that requires you to reevaluate what you think being a man is.
I love that, Jason. And I think, to your point, I think there are layers to it. Like if you're a Dominican man, if you are like to a certain extent, but I think when we talk about masculinity, a lot of the work is really just unpacking. I had to put that in the chat. What we've been taught doesn't work anymore. And what we're looking at even with this movement, the shit was not working. When we talk about the new normal, I don't give the normal that has not been serving us. The normal has been killing us. And so what we have to do as a community is look at the ways in which we've been told to show up. And also like gender conformity and what it means to have to be a woman and have to be a man. And disassociating ourselves from that. And that's hard work. And that's work on both sides. Like I've been in partnership with women who have needed me to be a certain way because that's what they identified manhood with. And a lot of that was tied to projections, trauma, whatever. A lot of the ways I used to identify how women were supposed to show up was whether that was due to media, whether that was due to how we've been taught and been raised. And a lot of our work is detaching from that and meeting people where they are. Because we're like, me as a man, how I get to show up and how I choose to show up for a partner, for a friend is going to be different. The conversations that Jason and I have might be similar to the conversations I had with a friend of mine, Fred, but they're going to be different based on like context, like history, nuance, all that shit. And my job, I think, as a man is to also recognize that and show up in ways that aren't defined by my manhood, but are defined by my humanity. And if I'm defining things by my humanity and my values, like how I love people, how I care for people, how I see people, that lives beyond gender and race. I can recognize gender and recognize race while also recognizing that my manhood is not attached to how I show up in these spaces.
He drops the mic, yo.
Thank you.
Oh, it is 8:35. We have been. Oh wait, Lord.
I think. Does anyone have any more questions? I think people have been.
Yeah, Lourdes has one. We have. Can we maybe do one question before we go? Because Lourdes has a question.
Yeah. Looking back, what would you have wanted to tell yourself at age 5 or younger? The first memory of you being you. I mean, 5 years old.
Yeah. I think it's something that is still very much a lifelong journey for me, and that is that I belong and that I'm enough. You know, that I don't have to be anything. I don't have to get a certain grade. I don't have to behave a certain way in order to know that I'm enough to be loved and that I'm worthy of being loved. And that even when I made mistakes, that was okay. That in fact, when I made mistakes was when I deserved to be loved even more. So yeah, I mean, I'm that's the thing. That's one thing that I wish I would have told my 5-year-old self. But the good thing is that I'm telling my 40-year-old self that every day. So it's never too late.
40.
Yeah.
Yeah, young.
Let them crack, bro.
I love it. I love it, man. You know what I'm saying? Like, you old as shit. I think I would have told my 5-year-old self. I mean, I would have told my 5-year-old self, 10-year-old self, it's okay to be yourself. You know, when we talk about, I don't the duality of experience. Like I grew up as a child who was told sometimes like I was like you're acting white, right? Because like I used to read like the dictionary and like shit like that. And I think a lot of that was like, it wasn't until I got to high school, right? Like I went to performing arts high school and it was like, oh, there were white kids who were listening to Bob Dylan and listening to like Nirvana, but then also like grew up in the same spots that I grew up in, and some who didn't, like who just grew up in Soho, and recognizing that I had room to give. I didn't know I had space to just be, and I wish 5-year-old self would have known that it's okay to just be, and you don't have to conform to what society and what your community is telling you have to be and what blackness looks like. There's a spectrum, there's a spectrum to a masculinity. There's a spectrum to our blackness and how we get to show up and how we choose to show up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great question. And anything else?
No. There's Kathy is asking to Jason on the men and women topic in the States or in our immediate society as Dominicans or Afro-Americans. What was your experience in Africa? What do you see similar and or different?
Wow. Really quick, I think it's just a lot of difference in terms of what you have to consider in terms of relationships, right? So here in the US, we don't really have to consider much in terms of what our partners bring to the table, right? It's, do we vibe? Great. And then if we vibe, then everything else is just a matter of, figuring it out. But I think in other places, particularly in countries in Africa, you have to also keep in mind the tribal component to it, right? Like, or the regional component to the ways that men and women interact. So that's just a completely different conversation, different Zoom. But I think it's a completely different experience, and I would say that we have it a lot easier here in the U.S. as far as building interpersonal relationships. I don't know why it's so difficult for us to get it right. You're on mute. Man.
Sorry, I have motorcycles. Oh, they're driving me nuts, so I have to mute myself. The last question is from Eniola. When did you get the realization that what you have been taught does not work for you anymore? What age? What happened? What occurred?
I mean, I think
you snapped and you were like.
I love that question, and I think it really goes back to Jason's comment about outcomes. I think that's an ever evolving conversation because I'm still unpacking shit. There's still things that I'm not even aware of that I probably won't be aware of till like 2 days from now, 2 years from now, whatever. I will share something I heard from a Dharma talk surrounding Buddhism. And the woman who was speaking was, she was talking about how she doesn't like the word enlightenment because it's a noun and it's a fixed action, but she likes awakening because it's a verb. And so it's constantly evolving, constantly moving. And I think for me, I'm constantly being aware of what works and what doesn't work for me anymore and trying to be aware of that. And, you know, like, I didn't know what intersectionality meant until maybe like 3 years ago. Like, I didn't go to school. Like, I didn't go to college. Like, I didn't know Kimberly Crenshaw was like developing this in like the late 80s. Like, I had no clue about this. And so I think part of the work, and granted, I might have been speaking it, but I didn't know the definition of the work. And so for me, it's really being cognizant of that and constantly unpacking and questioning how I show up. Like, oh, does this work? Is this working in my relationship with my partner? Is this working in relationship with my family? Is this working in relationship to the movement? And constantly trying to do the work, trying being the operative word, to show up and do that work in that way.
Yeah. Yeah, no, for me, it's very simple and very similar, right? Like, I've experienced very traumatic events in my life, and you know, and I just vowed that coming out of those events, I wasn't going to repeat the same patterns, or at least I wasn't going to try. And so I think, you know, the way we learn is by what we assign pain to and what we assign pleasure to, right? Like, those two are the most powerful motivators in our lives. And so for me, I just got to a point in my life where certain experiences were just too painful and I didn't want to repeat them again. And so those were my motivators to do something different, take different actions. So I think that's as simple as that, is maybe look at where you're experiencing pain versus pleasure, and what you apply pain to. All right. Another example is if, you know, you're trying to get a 6-pack and, you know, you assign the pain of being embarrassed of taking your shirt off at the beach, then that pain has to be deep and strong enough for it to motivate you to go to the gym. So same thing, changing your life, right? Like, look at where you're experiencing pain in your life and then decide to act from there.
Thank you, guys. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. You mentioned a few books that you want to recommend to everyone who joined us tonight. Could you mention what those books are and say it slowly, because everybody get your pen and paper.
Well, one is already in the chat.
Get some pen and paper and let's take write down the books that these gentlemen are sharing with us.
Yeah, well, one of them is already in the chat. It's The Pedagogy of the Oppressed. Incredible book. It's you know, it's a historical take on, you know, the history of oppression globally. So it's not a page turner by any means, but it's definitely something to add to your bookshelf. But then the other one that I'd mentioned earlier was Owning Your Own Shadow, and I'll type it in the chat. But it's called Owning Your Own Shadow: Understanding the Dark Side of the Psyche. It's literally only 68 pages, 70 pages, so you can read that in a day. But what it does is walks you through how you actively, so, you know, a lot of us are talking about doing spiritual work, right? And working on ourselves, but that's light work, right? That's working with the good parts of ourselves. But then there's another part of ourselves that makes up our shadow, right? Those parts of ourselves that we don't want to show people. And what this book tells you is that your light self, right? The person that you put forth to the world is impossible without this dark part. And so you need to actively go to the dark part and draw some things from that in order to continue to feed the person that you show up to the world to be. So definitely a great book. It's a quick read, but I guarantee you it'll change your life.
And you might want to pair that with a therapist.
Absolutely, or a journal. Right.
Journaling, therapy, that is helpful.
I saw Kathy recommending an Ayanna Von Zandt book. I wish I could remember the title of the book.
In the meantime, Kathy,
yeah, but there's another book that there's another book, Angie, that Ayanna wrote that I forget. It was something that had like black men.
Is it the one in the valley?
No. It was like a red cover. It was dedicated to black men. It was the first book I actually started reading. Like, before I started reading Power of Now, all that other shit. Like, it was a work that was addressed to Black men and about how Black men can unpack their own trauma. And some of that is kind of...
well, there you go. Just Google search that, everybody.
Yeah. And some of that was kind of steeped in like, it was steeped in kind of like stereotypical like Black man roles per se, but there's a lot of like, if you can, and I think what we're also talking about in this conversation and something I want to bring up is not necessarily not throwing out the baby with the bathwater, but recognizing that sometimes we attack folks without looking at the behind the work. And it's really easy to kind of get stuck on who the person is and missing the nuggets within the message that they're trying to convey. And Ayana in that book, some of that again was steeped in some patriarchal roles, but a lot of that shit was very informative in that way. Real quick, Freedom Dreams by Dr. Robin D.G. Kelly. Essentially, it's really about the Black imagination, and I've been trying to do a lot of work around that. Like when we talk about police, abolishing the police and like the abolition movement of itself. Yes, the spirit of a man. Thank you, Karen. Like when we talk about abolition work, a lot of that work is about how do we get to reimagine systems and systems that have been like essentially oppressing us. And what does it look like to look outside of the external circumstances we've been placed in? And so when we talk about finding Black joy, and Black joy being both rebellious and revolutionary, it's about how do we not conform to the external circumstances that are trying to oppress us. And I think Freedom Dreams is really good.
Freedom Dreams, that one is called?
What? Yeah. Two more resources. He didn't say it, so I'm going to say it for him. Please pick up Joel's book, God Wears Durags Too. Incredible book. So, you know, it's not something that you would read in a day, but it's something that you continue to come back to time and again. So please pick that up. And then his TED Talk, I can't stress that enough. It resonated with me as a co-parent, right? So someone who has had to raise a child from very early on. But, you know, I would say we can all learn something about love and about patience and empathy from watching that. So it's not just about parenting. So please check that out.
Here's Joel's other book. Book about the things I would tell my daughter.
Boom.
And you know, I one thing I like to say, like, you know, I wouldn't get too bogged down by the timing in which you meet people. Like, I could wish that I would have met and known a Jason when I was like 22, you know, or 20, but I'm 37. You know what I'm saying? And like, I think it's important for us to recognize how we connect with people when we connect with people and engaging and embracing that, regardless of whenever and however that happens. So,
yeah.
He's around now. Don't play yourselves. Go follow him. Go follow his platform. Follow his work. Get to know all the beautiful things that Jason is doing with our Black men.
Oh, word.
All right, good people. Well, love each and every one of y'all. Thank you for hanging with us for 2 hours. I hope it was
thank you guys. Thank you.
It was a good use of your time. Thanks, Angie. Joel, I love you, bro. We'll be back at this tomorrow. You already know.
Yes, you guys have a whole day tomorrow. All right. Have a good night, everybody.
Good night.